25 million people and 3 million acres of farmland rely on water from the environmentally deteriorating Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The governor's multi-billion-dollar plan, called the California Water Fix, involves building 2 enormous tunnels in the north to divert water around the delta to the south, where it can be sent to Central and Southern California. Producing a viable plan to move the Twin Tunnels project from concept to reality, however, is proving more challenging than anticipated. So what is the current status of the Twin Tunnels project? We'll ask Elaine Howle, California State Auditor. The governor's Twin Tunnels project, pipe dream or water fix?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Well, you can't fault Governor Brown for lack of trying. During his first stint as governor in the 1970s, he proposed something called the Peripheral Canal to ensure that the Delta water could provide a safe and reliable source of water for Californians while protecting the Delta's ecosystem. Well, it didn't happen. So when he returned to the governor's office in 2010, he began looking for a new way to deal with the Delta issue, and he ultimately came up with the idea of the Twin Tunnels. So how is the governor's new proposal faring? And by the way, is it going according to plan? Our guest is Elaine Howle, the California State Auditor, who recently issued a report on that very issue. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So the genesis behind the governor's Twin Tunnels proposal, it's also called the California Water Fix for the San Joaquin Delta. What is the genesis behind that? Why does the governor think it's needed?
Well, as you indicated, it's both conveyance of water to the Central Valley farmers, but certainly to Southern California, but combined with habitat restoration and the ecosystem, protecting the ecosystem in California. And certainly the current system, there's concerns with damage to or endangered species. Certain fish are hurt when the pumps are running, and there's this reverse flow, so the fish are essentially sucked into these pumps, so they have to reduce the water flow.
The pull is so great, it reverses the water flow, so the fish think they're going out to the sea, but they're ending up in the
Exactly,
in the pumps.
they're coming back into the pumps, so they have to, what the state has had to do is reduce the water flow, which reduces the amount of water to the Central Valley, to farmers, and certainly to Southern California.
Yeah, I want to just give folks an idea of how big this project is, the Delta is to water in California. 25 million people rely on the Delta for water, well, in Southern California in the Valley, but also 3 million acres of farmland. So
Right.
This is a big deal.
It's a huge deal
major
for our
source
state.
of water. Okay, so currently, how is the water transported from the Delta to the San Joaquin Valley and Southern California?
The current system that California has, there's two, essentially. There's a central water project, and then there's the state water project.
So federal and state?
Federal and state. Okay. Central water project is federal, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Right. The state water project is overseen by the Department of Water Resources. So these are systems that convey or transport water to the Central Valley and certainly to Southern California.
And I did a little research on this and how much water is actually flowing from these projects. And for the state water project, it's 2.3 million acre feet of water a year. And for the federal Central Valley project, it's 7 million acre feet of water per year. An acre feet is, I guess, if you flood an acre of land, that's, I don't know how they came up with this, but anyway, that's,
right.
That's how they judge it. So the federal one is a little bit bigger. It's a bigger
Right.
project. I mean, they draw from both, but the federal project is a little bigger.
Right.
So some planning efforts began in 2006 to kind of address kind of the environmental and economic issues regarding the Delta. Can you describe what happened?
Sure. In 2006, they started working on what was called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan or program, and that was looking at those two issues, the conveyance, transport of water, but also restoration of the habitat and the ecosystem in California.
The twin goals, the two goals.
Right, the two goals of this particular program. So they started doing some planning, you know, under California CEQA, you have to do an environmental impact report, do some cost analyses, those sorts of things. So there was a lot of planning going on starting in 2006.
But then the governor comes into office and he's kind of says, you know, the Twin Tunnels project proposal is an idea I can get behind. What is that proposal about?
Right. So what the governor actually asked the state to do was, let's not just look at one alternative, let's look at a variety of different alternatives. So they worked with some consulting firms, heard comments back from environmental groups, water contractors, all of the different stakeholders involved in a project like this and came up with various alternatives. And ultimately, the alternative that was selected was water fix. And water fix is strictly conveyance. It's strictly transport. There's another project called EcoStore, which is related to the restoration. Exactly.
Right. But the first one for conveyance, $14 billion-ish is the cost of the project, I think?
Well, the original planning, the original budget for planning for what was called BDCP, Bay Delta Conservation Conveyance Program, was about $13 billion, but certainly that's increased significantly now.
Okay. So how's it going to be funded? Who's going to pay for it?
Well, the payments actually would come from water contractors, the recipients of the water. Ultimately, ratepayers will pay, but it's the various water contractors that get water through the State Water Project. And certainly the federal project, Central Water Project, or Central Valley Project, excuse me, is under U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So I don't know that they will pay, but water contractors as part of the State Water Project will pay.
So let me kind of split up the issues. One is the issue of paying for the planning.
Right.
The other is actually the construction. So is there a difference there? Who pays? But planning's that's not required. These people don't have to pay for the planning. It's kind of a voluntary effort, right?
Right. The planning absolutely was a voluntary effort, and there was involvement for the federal government. U.S. Bureau of Reclamation put some money in, about $80 million in some of the planning, and then there were some key, Metropolitan Water District, Kern Water Agency that contributed to planning. But any water contractor that contributed funding for planning did it voluntarily.
Right. They don't know if it's actually going to happen, so it's they're kind of betting that it's going to happen, but we don't know. So we're going to talk about the costs that keep going up with this project and the delays that seem to keep happening with this project. Why is it happening? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a project that her office recently worked on. It was planning. How's the planning going, basically, with the governor's Twin Tunnels project? And as we're talking about, that's a large infrastructure project. And you found, though, that the state's experienced some significant cost increases and delays in just the planning process alone. What's causing the problem?
Right, and we primarily looked at planning because that's what's occurred thus far. I mean, we haven't gone to, as a state, to design and construction yet. And clearly, this is one of the biggest and most complex infrastructure project that California is intending to embark on. So there's a lot of analyses that come into play. Certainly environmental impact reports, cost analyses, financial analysis, economic analysis, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved. You've got water contractors, you have a steering committee that's involved. There has
just
been
water in California. That's an issue alone. You're guaranteed to have a lot of people.
Right. And you have the federal U.S. Bureau of Reclamation was involved in the planning aspect. So you have all these different entities involved. Plus, you're looking at various different scenarios. So you're having to do multiple types of analyses to determine what's the best approach to achieve the goal.
Yeah, but you said in your report, the cost and timeline for preparing the plan increased because of the scale and unexpected complexity of the project. Now, when I read that, I said, wait a second. You're making a major change in a major source of water for the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. How could they not know this is a large, complex project? And if you think about, the governor really has had really two major infrastructure projects. One is high-speed rail, and the other is this Delta Twin Tunnels project. You would think, wow, this is a big deal. We need to understand that. It's a complex project.
Yeah, and I think, in fairness to the Department of Water Resources and the administration, they knew it would be a complex project. Absolutely. I think what they experienced was more comments based on draft environmental impact reports. Then they were consistently wanting to address those comments, and that
kind of too many cooks in the kitchen, right?
Required additional analyses and so many stakeholders involved, and they're trying to really hear from folks and do analyses to make sure that they're addressing all the concerns that are being brought up.
So a stakeholder has a concern,
complex.
and they're going to chase that concern down and address it for that person. Then another stakeholder is going to chase that one down, and all those things cost money.
Absolutely.
It's a thorough job,
but
it just begins to become like a mushroom cloud. It gets bigger and bigger. So you note that the cost to evaluate and plan the implementation rose significally. How much did it go up, and what was driving that?
Well, the original, as again we talked about, the Bay Delta plan was originally about $13 million. That rose to close to 50 or 60 million. But right now, all of the planning costs, where they've addressed different scenarios and ultimately landed on water fix, what we identified was about $280 million
Wow.
in planning, and it's the environmental reports, responding to public comment, doing additional analyses, going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, we received these comments, we need to address those, and then you put out another draft EIR. So it's a lot of that really
when you think about
thorough process.
it does sound a lot. You know, 280 million is a lot of money, but we're talking about a minimum of what, a $14 billion project.
Right.
And so it seems like, and this has been a pattern we've talked before about, you know, they kind of want to cut corners a little bit on the planning because they don't want to spend a lot of money, but then it ends up biting them later because they have all these problems because they didn't thoroughly analyze it.
Right, and I think in this particular project, and during the course of the audit, talking to the Department of Water Resources Agency, they really did want to make sure they put out their draft EIR and they received more comments than you would typically receive, at least that's from their perspective. And we looked at all of that evidence, and yeah, there was a lot of comment, there were a lot of different considerations that needed to be addressed, and then the different scenarios and different analytics that they needed to do. So it's important to do appropriate planning, particularly with a project of this size.
Like people are going to complain if you don't plan enough or if they feel you
Right.
plan too much. I think I'd rather err on the side of planning too much because I think on the long run it's probably the best strategy. So, you know, at this point, what do you want to see the legislature and the state agencies do to kind of, you know, avoid these additional costs and time delays?
Well, similar to what we've talked about in other reports, either an IT project or a major infrastructure project like this one, where there again should be thresholds or milestones. So if the project is going to increase by 10% or a year, 12 months, and in fact there are some of the water agencies that have suggested similar types of thresholds where there needs to be a stopping point. Okay, let's readdress and take a look at it and say, oh yeah, we need to embrace these additional costs. It's important to do this additional analysis before we move forward.
So trigger. So you were talking in your report about if the budget increases by 10% or if the schedule's increased by 12 months. You know, let us know.
Right.
That seems to make sense. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the team planning the Twin Tunnels project. Were they in over their heads? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle regarding some issues surrounding the governor's Twin Tunnels project to secure water from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta without destroying the delta in the process. You know, we were talking about how large and complex this project is. In one of the state's, you know, major infrastructure projects, it would seem like you better have good management. It would seem to be critical. But that seems to be a bit lacking here from what I'm reading in your report. How would you like to see the state go about selecting? Let's start selecting a project manager. What would you have liked to have seen done?
Right, and the way the state process works for an infrastructure project, or they refer to it as architectural, can't say that word, and engineering.
Right.
So you don't necessarily do a competitive bidding process. You want to find the best qualified, the person that has the qualifications, or the firm that has the best qualifications. Then you negotiate price. So you're looking for qualifications rather than price. That's more important, particularly in a project like this, a big engineering infrastructure
it's
project.
It's the penny wise, pound foolish. If you do cheap, and then all of a sudden the person doesn't have the skills you really need, that could cause a problem.
Right. So you want to do that. And actually, when we looked at what Water Resources had done to identify who the firm would be, they did follow a very robust process when they brought in URS. But after that, they made some changes that we questioned.
Okay, so yeah, so they went through a process. They then replaced the original project manager. What process did they go through at that point when they replaced the original project manager?
Right. So they hired URS, a firm that everyone's very familiar with.
No problem with the
major
process?
Firm. No, that was very robust.
Okay.
But about 13 months after they engaged with URS, they directed URS to switch out their program manager. So this is going to be someone responsible for managing the project, looking for those milestones and
pretty
triggers.
important.
Important position.
Okay.
When they first went out and identified URS, they said, we need somebody who's an engineer. Those sorts of things. But as I said, 13 months in, they say, no, we don't want you, this person's not working full time, we're not satisfied, so we want you to hire this other firm, Hallmark. Okay. So they basically...
Not the card company.
This is the Department of Water Resources essentially telling URS, hire Hallmark as a subcontractor to do the project management work.
And were they qualified? Did they have the required professional licenses?
Well, when we looked at Hallmark's qualifications, we asked DWR, why did you pick Hallmark? How did you identify that they were the appropriate firm to use? And then we compared the qualifications of that firm, or the president of that firm, against the original. He's not an engineer. He hasn't worked on major water infrastructure project, has done project management, but we didn't see that this individual, Hallmark, that works for Hallmark, possessed the qualifications that they were looking for in the first place.
So basically, my understanding reading your report is Metropolitan Water District recommended this firm, and then when you go and talk to them, well, why did you recommend it? What happened?
Right. So we first went to DWR.
Okay.
How did you identify Hallmark? Well, we heard from water contractors and Metropolitan Water District. Right.
Yeah.
So we spoke with the general manager at the Metropolitan Water District. Well, I've never worked with our district has never worked with that firm, but we heard from other water contractors. It was a third party recommended this firm. So we never really got to the bottom of how Hallmark was identified as the appropriate
Did they identify
firm.
the third party that
No,
recommended?
they never identified the third party for us. So they just said, water contractors were familiar with work this firm had done when UC
Though they had
Merced.
never worked with that firm.
Right, right. So we never really got to the bottom of how Hallmark was identified and why they were suggested by DWR.
A
to be
layperson
the
looking at
sub.
this would say, maybe it's who you know. It's curious that there was no documentation behind that.
Right.
So, but DWR stated that they made their own independent assessment. Don't worry, we made our own independent assessment. But after reading your report, it's clear that you were less than convinced about that. In particular, you seem to be troubled by the way DWR failed to follow the standard practice in making a selection. So can you talk about that? Lack of documentation, qualifications.
Right, right. So,
no competitive bid. That kind of
essentially, what Water Resources directed URS to subcontract, but really, Hallmark wasn't serving as a subcontractor to URS because they weren't reporting to URS. They were reporting to Water Resources. So Water Resources was approving all of the work that Hallmark was doing, basically approving the invoices and telling URS to pay them. So they weren't really, it wasn't
more like
true.
a prime
right,
contractor.
it wasn't, exactly. It wasn't really a true subcontract because URS didn't even select Hallmark. They were directed to contract with Hallmark. Ultimately, Hallmark ended up becoming a prime, having a direct contract with Water Resources. But they didn't go out for a competitive bid. They didn't follow typical contracting practices
why
in
that
the
happened
state.
in such a major project. But Hallmark had some problems, right? So almost to prove your point, they had to go out and subcontract many of the project management functions that they were supposed to do. And to add insult to injury, that means that DWR was paying Hallmark a 5% markup
Right.
To oversee these subcontractors. That's not saving money here.
That's right. And their justification when they said they wanted to go from Hallmark being a subcontractor to URS to a prime or a direct contract with DWR said, well, then we won't have to pay the 5% to URS because they're overseeing Hallmark. Well, now Hallmark is subbing, so you're still paying the 5%. And it also speaks to if Hallmark had all of the qualifications and the necessary expertise, would need to subcontract for additional support.
Why is it happening? Interesting. Well, up next, we're going to discuss whether these problems can be fixed before we get into the actual design and construction phase, if that happens. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what can be done to make sure the mistakes that we've seen in the planning process aren't repeated in the design and construction phase of the Delta Fix project? With us is Elaine Howle, California State Auditor. So after reviewing the planning process, you made several recommendations. Make sure that DWR, Department of Water Resources, can do a better job in the design and construction phase, if that comes to pass. One of the things you stress is the need to have a complete economic and financial analysis to make sure this product is financially viable. You'd think that had already happened. Can you explain?
Well, they started to do some analyses early on as far as the economic. I mean, the distinction between an economic analysis and a financial analysis for your viewers is economic analysis. Is it beneficial to the state of California? Is this something the state can afford? And do the benefits outweigh the costs? And what are all those benefits? Financial analysis is, okay, we've decided this is a viable project and it's important for our state.
The cost-benefit analysis worked out?
It says, yes, we need to go ahead with this particular project. How are we going to pay for it? So the economic analysis is one phase, the financial analysis is another. They started to do some work on some of those analyses, but again, the scope and the nature of the project changed. First, it was a combined conveyance, transport, and habitat restoration. Now it's been split out, so they had to do a different analysis. So some of what Water Resources' perspective I think is fair is, well, until we know who's going to participate how many of the water contractors are going to participate in water fix, then we will know how far the cost should be spread.
You know, whether Westland's Water District will participate or Metropolitan Water District will participate.
Correct. So it's exactly. So it's hard to do some of those analyses until you know. But what we suggest is, as soon as you do know, then run the numbers and make sure that you understand, and all of the stakeholders understand, this is what I am, you know, my ratepayers and what my particular water agency is paying for this project.
And the kind of the overlay here is then the negotiations that are occurring between all these water agencies and the state, and who's paying for what, and how much are they going to be responsible for it.
Right.
And there you get into the Hall negotiations with water, which is just, well, it's been going on for many years in California. You also expressed some concern about DWR not implementing the appropriate governance structure for the project. Well, why is that an issue? Well,
governance structure is really important, and they actually had a consulting firm work on what they thought would be the appropriate governance structure. And basically that is who's responsible for what are the reporting relationships, what kinds of project management plans do we need to have in place so that somebody's constantly updating the plan and making sure that we are up to speed and current on all of the things that are happening with a major project like this.
Yeah, and you identified it was McKinsey, which is an international management consulting firm, to do this, create this governance structure. But correct me, there was also some other people talking about, I guess Hallmark and the State Water Project water contractors were also attempting to create, I guess, a government structure as well, simultaneously, or?
Well, Hallmark actually contracted with McKinsey to do this this analysis. It's one of their subcontractors to come up with, and they talked about an enterprise unit within the Department of Water Resources. So when we were talking to Water Resources, they said, yeah, we have that as a starting point, but they never got a final draft or a final version from McKinsey. But they do have at least a foundation for where they could go now as far as a final governance structure.
This is this enterprise unit you're talking about. So has that really been final? That hasn't been finalized.
No, it hasn't been finalized, and actually they're going to go back and reassess and determine whether or not they want to continue with that governance structure, do something different. But again, it'll be dependent upon decisions that are made as who's in, who's out, who the stakeholders are.
So it seems like they really can't make that decision until they know who's going to be participating.
Right, but our point is we're close to the end of planning. We're getting ready to move forward with design and construction. Let's get some of these, the governance structure in place, start working on the economic analysis, finalize a financial analysis, that sort of thing.
It seems like implicitly you're saying, listen, we got to get these negotiations done because you can't go into the design and construction without knowing the cost, the economic analysis, you know, the government structure. You can't do that, right? So yeah, so get moving with that, which is probably a good point. I think most people would agree with you. So you also were troubled a little bit by the documents and the reporting that was going on a little bit. What documents did you want them to maintain, and why are they important?
Right, and the Department of Water Resources does have a database called ACONEX, and it has all kinds of materials in there. Our concern was when we accessed that, and they stepped us through it and showed us the database, it's basically a repository. So we weren't seeing a program management plan that had been updated consistently. We saw one developed back in 2008. It had been updated in 2009, but since then it hasn't been updated. So we wanted to see more order as far as their documentation so that they could demonstrate they're on top of this project.
And so it's really a project management issue.
Exactly.
Okay, well I want to thank California State Auditor Elaine Howle for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.